Welcome back. Everybody is talking about Mayor Pete Buttigieg, and we wanted to talk to him so badly that we have him on the phone from the back seat of his car, the way CNN used to do with Donald Trump back in the day. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Mayor.
Sure thing. Glad to be on the line with you.
Thank you for joining us from the road. Okay, so of course, you are having what's fair to say a moment right now. It's not just on Twitter. We're beginning to see it reflected in polls. I want to ask you this. How are you going to keep up this momentum and not just be the guy that when we look back, we're like, oh yeah, what was his name? He was really hot for a minute in the spring of 2019.
Yeah, I think for anybody who wants to outlive a sort of flavor of the month phase, the most important thing is substance. So what we're trying to do is put forward an account of where America is headed, what we think we need to do about it, what freedom, democracy, and security mean in substantive terms, especially why they point in a progressive direction, in my view. And, you know, this moment for me really began with the CNN town hall. But what I said that night wasn't that different from what I've been saying everywhere I go. And so the big lesson I took away from it is there can be a very powerful response to what we have to say, but we need to make sure people actually hear it. And as exciting as it is to have a lot of buzz right now and be seeing that momentum and even seeing it reflected in some early polling, I'm under no illusion that most people have tuned into this process at all, let alone know about our message. And so we just got to work twice as hard and make sure that we stay honest, substantive, and grounded in the whole process.
I think if you had sort of asked hack political journalists like me a few months ago what was going to be happening right now, we would have said that Beto O'Rourke was going to be the hot new thing, and instead it seems to be you. Do you feel bad for him at all, that you've taken his kind of space?
I think there's room for a lot of us in this process, especially when it's as early as it is. I do think it's interesting that, there's a kind of half-life now on what's considered new. And it's amazing how much shorter that kind of half-life has become just in my political lifetime. But to me, that makes it all the more important that you just arrive with a real substantive center of gravity that carries you through moments when everybody's looking you over and moments when they're not, so that you have a thread that pulls you all the way through.
I do think that you have now gotten to the place where there's a bit of a Mayor Pete backlash underway, which I think, I saw Matt Stoller tweeting overnight, sort of former Bernie Sanders staffer who likes you, thinks you're a kind man, but said, my issue with Pete Buttigieg is that he's a McKinsey guy who has no enemies, and this means he will end up as a servant of the powerful. And that he show me who he's willing to fight, and I think that's a contrast with Elizabeth Warren, with Bernie Sanders, who have kind of spent their careers on the outside in a certain way. You did come up through these, the great American institutions, the military, Harvard, McKinsey. So, and how do you respond to that?
Well, it's certainly true that I've participated in the business community. I've participated in the military, and that's part of my story. Another part of my story is that I walked away from the warm embrace of a comfortable position in that establishment in order to do something really quirky, which was to take on a sitting state treasurer, because I believed that his effort to destroy the rescue of the auto industry was going to harm American union auto workers and harm my home state. And I did it with little prospect of success, and I got my head handed to me in the election. But I learned a lot about what matters in our society. I learned a lot about how politics works. I learned a lot about myself. And so pretty soon after that, I was doing another thing that is not exactly out of the Ivy League McKinsey playbook, which is I decided to compete to become the mayor of my industrial Midwestern city, and found the most purpose of anything I've done in my career doing that, and really worked to make good on some of the same principles that are now motivating my exploration of the presidential process.
Okay, that's great. Let's talk about the gays, though, Pete. Here's a tweet from Ira Madison. He tweeted, y'all are going to stop talking about Mayor Pete like he's just another straight white man running for office. It's possible to critique how he is covered in the press versus women in the race without erasing the fact that his presence as an openly gay man means something. And I agree with that as a gay man myself. So I wanted to ask you, Pete, identity is, of course, important, especially for people who tend to vote on the left. Do you think of yourself as a candidate who just happens to be gay, or are you the gay candidate?
I think that might be a distinction without a difference. I mean, I'm a whole person, right? And being gay is part of who I am, and I'm proud of who I am. I'm proud of my marriage. I'm proud of my husband. I'm also not running to be a candidate for any one constituency group. So I'm mindful of the historic nature of being the first out candidate ever to compete for the presidency, or at least the first out elected official ever to do that. But also recognize that, part of what I think identity in its best sense can do for us is give us terms to have solidarity with others, others who may have experiences that I can't quite personally understand or relate to, but at least I know a little something about being other, or being part of a group that's on the short end of bias in our society. And I hope that will make me not only hopefully somebody that the LGBTQ community can take some pride in, if I can live up to that, but also somebody who can relate to anybody who has felt marginalized for any number of reasons in our country and in our society's life.
The Washington Post recently wrote that you actually wouldn't be the first gay president, that would be James Buchanan. And I understand you said the first out president. But this seems like the sort of thing that you would have a point of view on as a sort of a bit of a nerd. What do you think?
It kind of sounds that way, but my Gaydar is not great to begin with, and it definitely doesn't work over long stretches of time. So I think we'll just have to let the historians figure that one out.
Oh, I mean, I agree with you. My Gaydar also does not always pierce the time-space continuum, so I get it. But I did also want to ask you, and I think this is an important and difficult question. What is the most pressing LGBT issue of this moment?
Well, we need a Federal Equality Act. There's no question that it is unacceptable in 2019 that in vast parts of America, including a lot of Indiana, though thankfully not South Bend because we did something about this, but in a lot of America, you can still be fired or mistreated for who you are, and it can be perfectly legal. So it's not the only issue facing the LGBTQ community, but I think it's one whose time has come and that we need to act on. Look, we shouldn't fool ourselves that now that marriage equality is the law of the land, something that we have by the grace of a single vote margin on the Supreme Court, that doesn't mean the struggle is over. And, the struggles that trans Americans face. And again, I don't pretend to know what it's like to be trans, but I know that I got to stand up for fellow Americans who are transgender, because I know they've stood up for people like me.
I guess you're on the Breakfast Club yesterday and said that you were asked about Chickfila in a sort of related context. Said, I don't approve of their politics, but I kind of approve of their chicken, and that you seek to build that bridge. And I was curious. I mean, I think there was a sort of boycott. There was a boycott of Chick-fil-A, social media driven. And maybe I'm overinterpreting, but it sounds like you don't really buy into that kind of, I don't know, binary boycott culture. That I'm curious what you make of that.
I just want to make sure we don't overrate ourselves in terms of our ability to be pure in this regard. If you're turned off, as I am, by the political behavior of Chick-fil-A or their executives, and that leaves a bad taste in your mouth, so to speak, you decide not to shop there. I certainly get it, and I support that. But the reality is I think sometimes slip into a sort of virtue signaling in some cases where we're not really being consistent. I mean, what about all the other places we get our chicken from? Do we know, have we scrutinized the political contributions of the executives of other places that we get all of our food from? If there's a way to do it, and some people in the era of big data are starting to construct that, right, where you can align your shopping or your investing with your values, that's great. But I just want to make sure we're not too sanctimonious about this, because sometimes we put ourselves in this position of judgment that doesn't really hold up under scrutiny. And so, my belief is that we should primarily deal with political issues in the political arena. And when somebody's doing something, for example, wrong on LGBT rights in the political space, confront them, defeat them, and bring about a better policy.
I'm sure our viewers appreciate that a very sophisticated sort of enabling of continuing to eat Chick-fil-A. Something many of us are looking for.
You're not going to rein me into this, Ben. Pete, I was recently in Indiana. I got to spend some time at Indiana University in Bloomington, and I had a wonderful experience. But also throughout my 2 days there, students and faculty members kept talking to me about the KKK presence in Indiana, their own experiences dealing with white nationalism in the state, which has a long history in Indiana. So what has being an elected official from Indiana, knowing its history, taught you about dealing with white nationalism?
Well, it certainly creates a level of obligation to provide a powerful counter current to that. It's true, the Klan's roots are largely in Indiana. There was a time when a majority of state legislators, I believe in the 20s, were affiliated in some ways with the Klan. I mean, just an absolutely grotesque history. And I think our responsibility, especially given what we've learned about our country in the last couple, 3 years, is not to pretend that that history is over. It was Faulkner who said that the past is never dead. It isn't even past. And so with white nationalism on the rise and it being a very real, clear presence and deadly threat that the current president and administration don't seem to want to confront, it creates an obligation for anyone in a position of authority or power or even just visibility, to speak out about why it's wrong, why it's not consistent with American values, and why if we really want to talk about security and safety, then that has less to do with putting up a wall from sea to shining sea than to making sure that people are not continuing to be radicalized into violent white nationalism with what seems at best to be a level of negligence, if not encouragement, coming from the highest office in the land.
You've said that you don't like to demonize your opponents, but would you consider your fellow former Indiana official Mike Pence a supporter of white nationalism at this point? And further, you've talked about how Pence has seemingly changed since he started running the country. But earlier, as we were talking to you, you highlighted employment as the pressing LGBT issue of our time. And 2007, Pence voted against an Employment Non-Discrimination Act. So how are you reconciling your perception of Pence? It seems like he's been very consistent.
Oh, he has. He's been consistently horrible and holds beliefs that are sincerely awful when it comes to LGBT equality and a lot of other issues whenever there's a contest between, I would say, what is rational and what he believes is his interpretation of his religion. In terms of white nationalism, I'm sure he does not consider himself to be a racist, but I think the moment you come on board with a project like the Trump campaign or the Trump-Pence administration, you are at best complicit in the process that has given cover for a flourishing and resurgence of white nationalism in our midst.
Okay. And just one last question. This has been a hot topic, not just on Twitter, but quite frankly, in my group text. We got to talk about your last name, Pete. It's always a hot topic, of course, but here's a tweet from Chris Johnson. He said, just got back after a few days seeing family in Michigan, where I heard my mom refer to Pete Buttigieg as Beetlejuice. I think that's the most creative pronunciation yet. I've come up with some weird versions myself in the last few days. What are the top 3 worst ways you've heard your name said?
Well, let's see. I've gotten Buttinger. I've gotten Butter Egg. Somebody the other day I saw was settling for Pete Build-A-Bear. It's just a little easier to remember. So the good news for me is, elections are multiple choice. So as long as you're able to pick it out of a lineup, I think I'll be okay.
Okay, Pete Build-A-Bear 2020.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks a lot. Good to be with you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, friends. Stay tuned for more AM to DM. Pete Build-A-Bear. It's pretty
good.
That's pretty good.